Welcome the anointed ones. When a chosen one opens their mouth, kingdoms tremble, not because they shout, but because they expose what was never supposed to be heard. Let that sink in. Here's a bone-chilling fact for you. Some of history's most powerful revolutions didn't begin with war. They started with someone finally speaking up after centuries of enforced silence. Not yelling, just telling the truth. So don't underestimate the explosion that happens when a chosen one, who was groomed to keep quiet, finally finds their voice. And you? Oh, you didn't just whisper your truth. You spoke with the thunder of a soul that's done being muzzled. You dropped verbal grenades that rearranged entire dynamics, uprooted generational curses, and exposed the nastiness they thought was permanently buried. You shifted spiritual realms with a sentence. You made fake alliances collapse with a paragraph. You made liars sweat with a truth so sharp it shaved their egos bald. Now they want to act brand new, scrambling, spinning narratives, playing victim on a stage they built to control yours. But deep down, they know the moment you spoke, everything changed. And look, we're not here to be modest about it. We're not going to pretend your voice didn't cause a spiritual earthquake. It did. And if they didn't want the smoke, they should have left the match alone. So grab your tea, stretch your discernment muscles, and buckle up, because what you said wasn't just brave. It was divinely disruptive. Let's unpack how your voice rewrote the story and why the world will never be the same. Number one, you weren't just speaking, you were breaking centuries of silence. When you finally spoke up, it wasn't just about you, it was much bigger than that. You cracked open a vault that had been sealed shut for generations. You gave voice to pain that had been passed down like an unwanted family heirloom. That moment wasn't just you telling your side of the story. It was an ancestral scream finally finding sound. You weren't just speaking for yourself, you were speaking for the ones who never got the chance. The ones who were silenced, shamed, disbelieved, and buried with secrets still clawing at their throats. And whether you realized it or not, your voice carried all of that. That's why the room got quiet. That's why the energy shifted. That's why people panicked, because they knew the moment you opened your mouth, it was over. The curtain got ripped. The spell broke. The system, whether family, religious, workplace, or community, that was designed to keep you small and obedient couldn't survive your truth. Your voice was too real, too raw, too undeniable. See, silence is what holds toxic systems together. That's their glue. And you broke it. You didn't just speak, you detonated. You interrupted the cycle in real time. What had been allowed to grow in the dark for decades suddenly had light shining on it, and light doesn't lie. That's why the aftermath felt like an earthquake, because you shook something spiritual, not just social. And the wild part? You probably thought you were just standing up for yourself. But that one act of courage did more than protect you. It opened doors for others. Your voice made it safer for people around you to start questioning what they've been swallowing their whole lives. Your truth gave their truth permission to rise. That's why you've been targeted. That's why they scrambled to discredit you. It's not because you were wrong, it's because you were right. Too right. So right it threatened the fake peace they built on other people's silence. But you chose truth over comfort. And whether they admit it or not, nothing has been the same since you did. Your words broke chains, and some people are still mad they didn't get to choose which ones. Number two, your voice was the evidence the universe was waiting for. The moment you spoke, something divine took note. Your words didn't just hang in the air, they were received, recorded, and recognized in realms far beyond what people could see. You might have thought you were just venting, just clearing your chest, just finally saying what needed to be said. But in the spirit realm, your voice was proof. It was evidence. It was documentation that injustice had occurred and now the case could be opened. Before you spoke, your pain was real, but undocumented. It was floating in the shadows, dismissed as exaggeration or paranoia. But once you gave voice to it, everything changed. You gave your experience shape, you gave it weight, you gave it substance. And that's when divine justice could move. That's when the balance started to shift. You weren't just telling your truth, you were pressing spiritual charges. And people felt it, even if they didn't understand it. That's why they started acting weird. That's why some people who swore they were innocent began getting uncomfortable. Because when you speak the truth, it carries energy. It confronts, it exposes, it makes the guilty squirm without you even naming names. Because truth travels, it doesn't need an address. It just shows up and starts doing its job. When you finally said what you had been holding in for so long, you sent a ripple through spiritual systems. You didn't just shift your atmosphere, you gave heaven a reason to shift for you. You triggered compensation, you triggered protection, you triggered divine surveillance to go live. Now things are moving behind the scenes because your truth has been acknowledged. You see, silence protects the oppressor, but truth protects the wounded. And once your truth was spoken, a different kind of order got activated. You may not see the full results right away, but just know you've shifted things you can't even measure. The spiritual realm responds to truth, especially when it comes from someone who was expected to stay quiet forever. So when you spoke up, you weren't just brave, you were legally shifting atmospheres in the spirit. You gave your soul a voice and heaven responded like, now we can move. And trust me, it's moving. Number 3, your story was the final straw that exposed their carefully hidden rot. When you spoke, it wasn't just a confession, it was a collapse. You didn't raise your voice, you raised the volume on what they thought would stay hidden forever. That's why everything shifted the moment your truth came out. Because it wasn't just personal, it was surgical. You cut into something they spent years covering up. And the scariest part for them, you weren't vague, you weren't confused, you were specific. You spoke with the kind of clarity only someone who lived through hell could have. They thought they had time. They thought the lies were solid. They built their version of events with such confidence that even they started believing it. But when you opened your mouth, it was like someone flipped on the lights in a room full of roaches. Suddenly, all their fake narratives started falling apart. People began seeing them differently, not because you trashed them, but because your truth didn't match the mask they wore. Your words exposed the hypocrisy, the cruelty, the manipulations, not in a dramatic, over-the-top way, but in a detailed, undeniable way. That's what made it dangerous, because you weren't guessing, you were remembering, and you remembered too much for their comfort. That's why they're spiraling, that's why they're doing damage control, because your voice didn't just challenge their version, it destroyed it. You need to understand, what you said hit deeper than you know. You confirmed suspicions other people already had but didn't want to face. You connected dots others were too afraid to connect. And now, the fake alliances they built are starting to turn on each other. People are looking at them sideways. That smooth-talking, mask-wearing act doesn't work anymore. Because your words revealed the cracks in their character, and once people see those cracks, they can't unsee them. You didn't plan to dismantle anything, you were just trying to breathe, but your truth came with power, and that power exposed their rot. Not because you're malicious, but because they were never clean to begin with. Your voice was the final straw. You didn't even know it, but you held the one truth that made their entire empire fall apart. And now, they're dealing with the fallout of your courage. Number 4. You spoke without permission, and that's what made it revolutionary. They never planned for you to speak. In fact, the entire setup was built on the assumption that you wouldn't. You were supposed to sit quietly in the background, play your role, smile through the dysfunction, and keep their secrets safe. That was the unspoken agreement they tried to lock you into, submit or be shunned. But you tore the contract in half the moment you decided to use your voice without asking for their approval. That wasn't just bold, it was revolutionary. You didn't wait for their permission because you knew you'd never get it. They only hand the mic to people who will lie for them, protect the image, keep the facade in place. But you weren't interested in being their puppet. You didn't come to protect reputations. You came to tell the truth. And the truth didn't need a fancy introduction. It just needed a willing vessel. And you showed up. That's why they're mad. Not because you lied, but because you didn't. You told it exactly how it was. Raw, unpolished, real. You spoke like someone who had nothing to lose, and that's the kind of voice that shifts atmospheres. Because people can smell the difference between rehearsed narratives and lived experience. You weren't there to impress anyone. You were there to clear the air. And when you did, you shattered the illusion they had worked so hard to maintain. They're used to controlling the story. They're used to gatekeeping the narrative, choosing who gets to be heard and who gets silenced. But you bypassed their system entirely. You spoke anyway. You told your truth on your terms, in your tone, at your timing, and it rattled the structure because you didn't just speak, you disrupted. You weren't trying to perform, you were trying to free yourself, and in doing that, you freed others too. You cracked the mirror wide open. You gave people permission to question what they've been taught to accept. You didn't knock politely. You kicked the door down, and when they turned to see who it was you. The one they underestimated, the one they thought they had under control. They didn't see it coming. And that's why it worked. Number 5, they weaponized your silence. So you turned it into a sword. Your silence was their playground. While you kept quiet, they felt bold enough to create their own version of your story. They filled in the blanks with lies that made them look innocent and painted you as unstable, bitter, or just hard to deal with. They got used to that silence. It gave them freedom to move recklessly and spin narratives without resistance. And the more you stayed quiet, the more they inflated their confidence, thinking you'd never dare speak up. They used your quietness as a cover, a disguise. They twisted it into proof that they must be right, because if you weren't saying anything, then maybe you were guilty, or maybe you were too weak to confront them, or worse, maybe you were just too broken to even know what was happening. That's how they played it. Your silence became their shield and their sword. But then you broke that silence. And when you did, it wasn't soft. It wasn't unsure. It was sharp. It was deliberate. It was surgical. You didn't just tell your truth. You dismantled their lies brick by brick. And what they never expected was that your silence had been watching the whole time, absorbing, remembering, building power. By the time you spoke, you weren't operating from emotion. You were operating from clarity. You used the very thing they relied on against them. You took the silence they once weaponized and turned it into a blade they couldn't dodge. You burned the stories they built in your absence and left behind a truth so undeniable they couldn't breathe without choking on it. They thought they had the upper hand, but your words flipped the entire game board. Now they're bleeding from the edges of a story they thought they owned. And no matter how much they scramble, they can't get your truth back into silence. It's out. It's alive. And it's cutting through their falsehoods like fire through paper. You didn't just speak to defend yourself. You spoke to destroy what was built on your back. And now they can't lie the same way anymore. The silence they used against you became the weapon you used to win. Number 6, your words became a map for the lost. You had no idea how far your voice would travel. You weren't trying to be a leader, a guide, or a symbol for anything. You were just telling your truth. But the moment you let those words leave your lips, something bigger happened. People started to hear themselves in your story. They didn't just relate, they recognized. And for some, it was the first time they could finally say, that's what I've been going through, that's what's been happening to me. You gave people language for things they had been silently battling for years. Things they couldn't explain, feelings they couldn't name, abuse that had no bruises, manipulation that wore a smile. You gave it form. You made the invisible visible, and that's not a small thing. That's life-changing. Because when people can name their pain, they can start to escape it. They can start to heal. What you didn't know is that while you were surviving in isolation, so many others were doing the same. They were suffering in secret, convinced they were alone, thinking maybe they were crazy. But your courage opened a door. Your voice gave them direction. Your honesty gave them a map. And now they're walking through freedom using steps you didn't even know you were laying down. You weren't trying to inspire anyone, but your rawness became a lifeline. People who were lost in the fog of denial and dysfunction started finding clarity through your story. You gave their confusion a compass, not because you had all the answers, but because you were real enough to speak while still bleeding. And sometimes that's more powerful than a polished lesson. Your pain didn't just echo, it guided. And now people are stronger because you were brave. People are speaking up because you went first. You didn't just break silence, you broke chains for people you'll never meet. That's the power of truth. That's the power of voice. You thought it was just a moment for you, but it turned out to be a revolution for others. You lit the path by surviving out loud. And whether you realize it or not, you became the proof that healing is possible. Number 7, you didn't just break their control, you unveiled their insanity. They weren't prepared for your truth because they never believed you'd actually say it. And when you finally did, they didn't just panic, they unraveled. Not because you exposed some small secret, but because your truth was the one thread holding their entire performance together. And once you pulled it, the whole act fell apart. But what really stunned everyone wasn't the truth itself. It was how completely unhinged they became in trying to silence it. They didn't deny it calmly. They didn't address it with maturity. They exploded. They went into overdrive, lying, manipulating, twisting the narrative, dragging your name through dirt, calling in backup, even trying to flip the script so they looked like the victim. That level of frenzy, that's not normal. That's not sane. That's desperation. Because your truth didn't just expose a situation, it exposed their entire foundation. You didn't just take away their control, you revealed how unstable they were when they didn't have it. People always thought they were composed, respectable, put together. But your voice turned their mask into glass, and when it shattered, everyone saw what was really underneath. You didn't tell on them, they told on themselves with their reaction. The spiraling, the obsession, the fake tears, the smear campaigns, it all revealed one thing. They were never as in control as they pretended to be. They needed lies to stay calm. They needed manipulation to feel powerful. They needed your silence like a drug. When you cut that off, they started detoxing, and the withdrawal looked like madness. That's what the truth does when someone's entire identity is built on deception. It doesn't just hurt, it destabilizes. And your courage to tell the truth removed the one thing holding their illusion together: fear. Now they're stuck showing the world the version of themselves they've worked so hard to hide. And the irony, they would have kept their dignity if they had just let the truth stand. But their need to control everything, to bury everything, to rewrite everything, that's what really exposed them. You didn't go looking for war, you just told the truth. But in doing so, you showed everyone just how fragile and chaotic they truly are without their favorite weapon: control. Number 8, your voice broke the trauma cycle in real time. You didn't just speak, you interrupted a cycle that was programmed to repeat itself through you, and it wasn't random. That pattern of abuse, silence, shame, and damage had been running for generations like a hidden software, infecting everyone before you. It passed down through behaviors, reactions, secrets, and scars. Nobody questioned it because everyone thought it was normal. But then came you, and without even realizing it, you did something revolutionary. You told the truth out loud. That moment changed everything, not just for you, but for the entire lineage behind and in front of you. You became the break in the algorithm. Where others stayed silent, you spoke. Where others normalized dysfunction, you called it what it was. Where others hid their pain, you put light on it. And in doing that, you stopped the system in mid-motion. You caught the curse in the act and told it, "This ends with me." That's why your healing has felt so heavy. Because you're not just healing your own life. You're pulling threads that were stitched into your bloodline. And with every word of truth you speak, you're undoing layers of denial that were passed down like tradition. That kind of work is rare. That kind of work is sacred. It's the kind of work that future generations will benefit from, even if they never know what it cost you. You weren't supposed to be the one. That's why the attacks were so relentless. That's why the resistance was so strong, because the system sensed you were different. You weren't going to fall in line. You weren't going to protect dysfunction just because it was family. You weren't going to pretend abuse was love. You were the one who saw through it and had the guts to say something. And now, the cycle is glitching. People around you are uncomfortable. The silence that once protected abusers is now echoing with the sound of your truth. And guess what? The next generation is watching. They're going to grow up with a different story because you refused to carry what was never yours. You didn't just survive the trauma, you ended its reign in real time. Number 9, you humiliated hell's agenda by speaking up. From the very beginning, there was a strategy formed against you. A dark, calculated plan, not just from people, but from forces that operate in the shadows, the kind that don't show up in the physical, but manipulate everything from the background. The goal was simple: wear you down until you gave up, confuse you until you questioned your own reality, break your spirit so thoroughly that even if you survived, you'd never speak. They tried every tactic: lies, betrayal, emotional warfare. They used people close to you as weapons. They made you feel like the villain in your own story. They twisted your words, distorted your intentions, and tried to convince you that your truth didn't matter, or worse, that it never existed. And when isolation set in, that's when they thought they had you. They thought if they could keep you isolated long enough, shame would do the rest of the job. But you didn't fold, you didn't disappear. You did the one thing the darkness couldn't prepare for. You spoke. You used your voice. You told the truth. You made noise. And that sound shattered the silence they needed to keep their power. That single act, it humiliated every strategy hell designed against you, because here's what they didn't count on. The more they pressed you down, the more power your voice was gathering. What they thought was suppression was really storage. And when you finally opened your mouth, what came out wasn't weakness. It was a weapon, a sharp, precise, undeniable truth that couldn't be silenced, manipulated, or ignored. Hell doesn't fear your survival, it fears your voice. Because surviving silently is still bondage. But when you speak, when you expose, when you testify, when you bring the truth to light, you break chains, you rip veils, you awaken others. That's what makes your voice so dangerous, not just because it sets you free, but because it's now setting others free too. You flip the whole agenda. What was meant to bury you turned into a platform. What was meant to destroy you became your strength. And every demon that celebrated your downfall now trembles at the sound of your voice. You didn't just survive hell, you embarrassed it. Number 10, the moment you spoke, you became a mirror. They couldn't escape. When you spoke, it wasn't rage or revenge, it was raw, unfiltered truth. And the moment those words left your mouth, something shifted that couldn't be undone. You didn't point fingers. You didn't scream or curse or dramatize. You simply told what happened. But what they heard wasn't just your story, it was the reflection of themselves staring back. And that's what really broke them. Because for so long, they had convinced themselves they were right, that they were justified, that they were the ones holding it all together while you were the problem. They built an entire identity around that lie, but your truth shattered it in seconds. Not because you were aggressive, but because your clarity was undeniable. You spoke with the kind of quiet authority that exposes everything without trying. And suddenly they weren't looking at you, they were forced to look at themselves. That mirror you held up showed them everything they spent years avoiding. The manipulation, the lies, the emotional games, the projection, the abuse. It showed how far they were willing to go to preserve an image that was never real. And the most haunting part? You didn't have to embellish a thing. The facts alone were damning enough. Your voice disrupted the fantasy. It interrupted the script where they were the wise ones, the caring ones, the misunderstood victims. And in place of that illusion, your words left behind a reflection they can't unsee. That's why they're so triggered. That's why they're angry. Because deep down, they know you didn't invent anything. You just described what they spent years trying to hide. Now they're left wrestling with that reflection. Every lie they told about you now feels heavier. Every excuse they clung to feels weaker. And that discomfort, that's not your fault. That's their conscience finally waking up. Even if they never apologize, even if they keep performing, they know the truth was spoken. And that truth now follows them like a shadow. You didn't ruin them, you revealed them. You didn't bring destruction, you brought light. And the reason they can't face you anymore is because your presence reminds them of the mirror they're still trying to run from. But here's the thing. Mirrors don't lie. Number 11. You spoke what others were too afraid to even whisper. There were people who lived the same pain you did. They saw the same dysfunction, heard the same lies, felt the same weight pressing down on their chest day after day. They nodded in silence, cried behind closed doors, and prayed someone, anyone, would just say it out loud, but they couldn't because the fear was too deep, the backlash too brutal, the cost too high, so they kept quiet, hoping silence would somehow protect them. And then came you. You weren't supposed to say anything. You were supposed to follow the script, keep your head down and play your part like everyone else, but you didn't. You opened your mouth and said what they were only brave enough to think. You ripped the mask off a system everyone knew was broken, but no one had the nerve to confront. You were the one who reached into the shadows and pulled the truth into the light. That's why it hit so hard. Because it wasn't just your story, it was our story. The collective truth so many had buried inside themselves suddenly had a voice, your voice. You didn't just speak. You articulated what others didn't know how to express. You gave their silent suffering vocabulary. You said the unsayable. And you didn't whisper it in a corner. You said it with clarity, with boldness, and with fire. And that's what made it undeniable. You forced people to see what they had gotten used to ignoring. You disrupted the silence that made them feel safe. You shattered the illusion that no one else noticed. Your words weren't just heard, they echoed, they spread, and suddenly more people started nodding, speaking, standing, breaking their own silence because you went first. That's also why some people resent you, because your courage made their silence uncomfortable. It reminded them of the truth they buried to survive. You didn't mean to expose them, but your strength made their fear visible. And while some are drawn to you for that very reason, others keep their distance. Not because they hate you, but because you reflect the version of themselves they haven't become yet. You didn't just make noise, you made history in people's hearts. You broke the sound barrier of fear, and now the thunder of your voice still shakes the ones who only had the strength to whisper. Number 12. They thought discrediting you would mute the truth, but it only amplified it. They were banking on the oldest trick in the book: discredit the speaker so the truth gets ignored. They thought if they could make you look unstable, overly emotional or bitter, no one would take your words seriously. They didn't bother to address what you actually said. They went straight for your character. It was never about truth for them. It was always about control. And the quickest way to maintain control is to make the truth teller look like the problem. So they threw labels at you like weapons. They told people you were crazy, too sensitive, just angry. They mocked your emotions, minimized your experience, and tried to reduce your whole story to a tantrum. But what they didn't expect was how transparent their tactics would be. Because the more they tried to discredit you, the more attention they brought to you. And people started to pay closer attention, not to them, but to you. And when people actually listened, they didn't hear delusion, they heard detail. They heard someone who wasn't rambling but remembering, someone who wasn't spiraling but unpacking, someone who wasn't lashing out but drawing a clear line from cause to effect, from action to consequence. Your voice didn't sound unhinged, it sounded real. It sounded like lived experience. And the more people heard it, the more they recognized something they had seen or felt themselves. That's when the shift happened. What was meant to bury you ended up spotlighting you. People started sharing your words. They repeated your phrases. They quoted your truth in places you've never been, in rooms you didn't even know existed. The smear campaign became free advertisement, and the more they tried to paint you as unreliable, the more undeniable your truth became. Because there's something magnetic about truth. It draws people in, it sticks in their minds, it lingers in their spirit. You didn't need a PR team, you had authenticity. And no matter how much noise they made, your clarity cut through it. They thought tearing you down would silence the truth. Instead, they turned you into a broadcast. Now your story echoes louder than ever, and the very people who tried to shut you up are choking on the volume. Number 13, your voice triggered divine compensation. When you spoke your truth, it wasn't just a release, it was a realignment. You shifted from surviving in silence to standing in truth. And that move activated something in the spiritual realm that most people never talk about. It triggered divine compensation. Not because you asked for it, but because truth demands balance. And the moment you brought your story into the light, the spiritual scales started tipping in your favor. See, while you were quiet, heaven was quiet too. Not absent, but waiting, watching, taking record. Because truth has a divine weight to it. And once you dropped it, the universe had to respond. Your voice broke the agreement you unknowingly had with fear, shame, and secrecy. And the moment you broke that agreement, a new one was formed, one with divine justice, protection, and restoration. Things began to move in your favor, not because you forced them, but because spiritual law was catching up with spiritual reality. You started receiving clarity where there was once confusion. Doors began opening that had been sealed shut for years. People began showing up with the very resources, support, and confirmation you thought you'd never see. It was like something unlocked, and that something was your voice. You weren't just speaking up for healing, you were speaking into alignment. You aligned yourself with truth, and truth always comes with a cost and a reward. You paid the cost in pain, betrayal, and isolation. Now you're seeing the reward in peace, discernment, and divine upgrades you didn't even pray for, because telling the truth positions you for things that lies can never attract. You left behind survival energy and stepped into divine inheritance, and it keeps unfolding because once you align with truth, you also align with favor. That's why some people are confused about how you're still rising. They thought you were done. They thought breaking you would keep you down. But what they didn't realize is breaking silence also breaks curses. And when curses are broken, blessings begin to chase you down. You didn't speak for revenge. You spoke for release. But heaven heard it and responded like justice had just been summoned. And now you're walking into rooms where your name was once slandered and being honored instead. Number 14, your testimony made you untouchable. There's a power that comes with telling your truth out loud, especially when it's raw, honest, and unfiltered. Once you speak it, it's not just your truth anymore. It becomes part of something bigger, something that can't be pulled back or deleted. That's what happened the moment you gave your testimony. You became untouchable, not because you were trying to be a hero, but because you chose not to be a prisoner anymore. They tried to contain you through shame. They tried to isolate you with lies. They assumed if they stripped you of credibility, your truth would vanish. But instead, it multiplied. Your words weren't just spoken, they were absorbed, shared, and remembered. You became a living archive of everything they wanted buried. And now, even if they never speak your name again, your voice still lingers in the atmosphere. It's in the minds of those who heard it. It's in the hearts of those who felt it. It's in the energy of every space you disrupted with clarity. That's what they can't stand and what they can't undo. They can't reverse the exposure. They can't repackage the illusion. And they can't uncrack the glass you shattered when you stopped protecting their dysfunction. Your testimony is etched into the collective memory of everyone who was quietly watching, secretly relating, or deeply wounded. People who never knew how to put their experience into words suddenly found language in your story. And now that story is out of reach. It's in the air. It's online. It's in people's spirits. You're untouchable not because they don't still try, but because there's nothing left for them to hold hostage. You already gave it away. You stripped their leverage when you told your truth, and now they're stuck trying to fight a shadow that's already passed through every wall they built. They wanted you silenced, but you became a signal. You were supposed to be erased, but instead you're immortalized in the ripple effect of your courage. Your testimony didn't just protect you, it created a ripple strong enough to protect others too. And that's a force they can't censor, cancel, or control. They lost the moment you opened your mouth, because once the truth is spoken, it becomes a legacy. And you, chosen one, became legendary. They tried to make you regret ever opening your mouth, but what they didn't see coming was that your voice wasn't just volume. It was vibration. It broke chains, shook systems, and awakened minds that had been lulled into silence for years. Your words were never just about revenge or validation. They were about truth, finally getting the mic it had been denied for too long. By speaking up, you did more than defend yourself. You redefined the battlefield. You didn't need permission, a podium, or a polished speech. All you needed was courage. And the moment you released it, heaven and earth took note. You exposed what was hidden, gave name to the unspoken, and shattered illusions that were passed off as normal. That's revolutionary. And that's why they're still scrambling. You didn't just talk, you testified. You didn't just reveal, you resurrected truth in a world built on carefully crafted lies. And now your voice has become a blueprint, a map, a mirror, a warning, a prophecy, something that can't be erased or undone, no matter how many attempts they make to discredit or distort it. You're not the same person who once stayed silent to keep the peace. You're the one who destroyed false peace with sacred truth. You became the evidence, the ripple, the resistance, and there's no going back. So if you've ever doubted whether speaking up was worth it, remember this. You didn't just change the conversation, you changed the whole frequency, and the echo of your voice, it's still traveling. If this spoke to your soul, don't just scroll away. Hit that subscribe button and become part of a movement that's unapologetically rooted in truth, boldness, and divine purpose. Like this video if you've ever had to fight to be heard. Comment below and share the moment your voice changed everything. Your story might be the lifeline someone else is silently praying for. And don't forget to share this video with someone who's on the verge of speaking their truth. Let them know they're not alone, and that their voice matters more than they realize. This channel is for the bold, the brave, the chosen. Let's shake the atmosphere together, one truth at a time. God bless you.